Hi, guys. Welcome. Thank you for sharing the tiny space of the hallway with me. Tiny space for tiny work. My name is Brittany Ham. Very excited to speak to you guys today. Thank you again to Zyra and Art League Houston for having us for these wonderful exhibitions. So we have been here before is sort of a follow-up development to a show that I did in 2023 that was sort of talking about like personal experiences of going through like large life transitions. So in 2021, I became a parent. It was like off the back end of COVID. It was also off the back end of I'd like gotten this really wonderful, prestigious residency, and then had to like leave it a month early because COVID hit, and I had to like flee Berlin, which was like a pretty like rocky, experience. So in 2021, there were all these highs and lows, and now in 2025, we're sort of like past that like period of rockiness. But I also cannot help but think that like we're sort of like returning to cycles of, I don't know, things are getting tight and clenchy in terms of like reproductive rights and like what does it mean to be like a woman in 2025 living in Texas, getting rights, losing rights. What does it mean to be a parent to a daughter who now has to sort of grapple with these questions as I raise a child in the world? So a lot of this work was born out of two residencies that I had back to back stacked this summer, which was a lot of fun, but like a little bit chaotic. I was in North Carolina in Little Switzerland, the area that was just recently hit by flooding, unfortunately. In North Carolina for a week in a cabin in the woods alone, which was really really great. I was spending a lot of time with the landscape. The landscape has always been really important to my work, either like interior spaces or exterior spaces. Like the landscape of the interior being sort of like reflective of yourself, right? Your desires, your needs. But also, I think there's like a great tendency to like think of ourselves as separate from the landscape and like we are part of the landscape, right? We do not exist without nature in some context. So the exterior space has always been really important to my work as well. And while I was in North Carolina, I was just really struck by the landscapes that are present there. They're, obviously very different to what we have in Texas. There's like huge old growth forests. I was in the mountains. I was seeing these like large grand spaces and different altitudes. And I was really, really inspired by like how things sort of like fight to develop and grow in those spaces. Like the trees are like so tall and long, and they're all like fighting for sunlight, and they sort of like weave together like up to the sun, right? And like things like grow sideways and net through the trees and sort of lock things into position. So I was just really inspired by um, how those landscapes seem to like fight for survival, but also sort of like come together to ensure that those things were happening. So I'm thinking about the landscape in relation to sort of like being in community with other women, especially sort of in like in a 2025 like post-election state. Um, but yeah. So in the show, we're working with these smaller paintings that are layered on top of these larger paintings. I like to think of the smaller paintings as these sort of like musings of like experience or growth, right? Like to be like part of a community of like women who are working in like new growth and old growth that are, sort of like new experiences, new generations, older generations coming together to sort of like fight for that reaching of sunlight, versus like slightly more intimate experiences, right? I like to think of like what shape can the body make and like what does that shape do. So I'm thinking about like worm women a lot. I had some people last night at the opening talk about serpents, and I was like, that's a lot grander than what I was thinking about when I was making this work. So I think about like the experience of like making your way through the world as sort of like worming through and like crawling through the ground and coming back up and going back down is this like really slow process. So I'm thinking about like these like worm women who became like entangled in themselves and are sort of like enmeshed and dependent on each other, and like this like worm woman who is like weaving herself through the trees and sort of like continuously looping herself through like the same place, right? Like we have been here again, we have been here again. So we're working with the paintings. They are hung on top of these acrylic pieces that are supposed to be, they're these black and white grisaille paintings of the landscapes that sort of inspired these locations. I thought it was kind of like an interesting conversation to think about, like the real space versus like the imagined fantasy that is projected on top of it. I think there's like an interesting conversation between like how you perceive reality and like translate that in your experiences. Um, and then we've also got this large tapestry um, that is sort of about being stuck in a never-ending cycle, right? I begin, I crawl through, I breach, I become again. Um, yeah. I'm working sculpturally as well, talking about these conversations of like from like morning to dusk to night, right? Transitions between stages of life, having conversations about materiality as well. I'm really, really interested in painting. I like all kinds of painting, all mediums of painting. So I like to play with what it can do. So this was a fun little sculpture to make. It's fun to make a painting and cut it up, right? Unpreciouses it a little bit. Yeah, that's what I got. Yeah.
So it seems like from just looking at your work that these body forms, if you look kind of at a detail of them, it's difficult to discern them as a body at first. And it also has a real feeling of having a temporal element that like the body has become this long worm over time. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about adaptation as like becoming potentially unrecognizable or monstrosity, or like this body becomes something that doesn't read as body.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of my work has been really interested in like what is like the like sensation of being in a body, or like what does like a body do to adapt to like its location or its environment or like the experiences that it's going through. And I like to think of like the abstraction as of the body as being just like sort of visually representative of like change and transition. I think about like what does it mean to like bend your body into shape, right? That was sort of like the phrase that I was working with in previous exhibitions that helped me develop this like worm form. It was like I'm like bending myself into shape as I like change from role of like sort of like young person to like developing artist to mother to like now sort of cycling back out of those like early stages of motherhood. And I'm interested in like what would those shapes look like if we were really to like question them and like pull them out. But I like especially like the comment of the monstrous, I think is pretty apt as well, because it's like I don't know, like to have a body is sort of like a it's like fun because you get to eat pizza, but it's also kind of like a monstrous, like gross experience because like you're like a tube of meat that has to like navigate the world, to put it delicately. And I'm interested in sort of like visualizing that in a way that makes it weird, uncomfortable, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was a friend once said in grad school we're all just meat donuts.
Yeah.
That being said, I was wondering if you can talk about the kind of relationship about the external versus like the internal, because painting has always had this kind of, especially like rectangular painting, has had this relationship of being like a window, whether it's the out or inner world, and then also kind of seeing these like outside inside relationships, kind of looking at the work as well.
Yeah, sure. I find painting to be such like an internal and isolating experience, and I'm sure like people who paint experience this, like especially like in a post-education setting, you're like on your own, maybe with a window. I don't have any windows in my studio, right? It's like a completely closed-in box. I'm sure certainly like motivates my desire to like pull these like spaces into my studio. But I think like so much of like any painting practice is sort of like figuring out like where those like bounds of isolation end and like where do you get into your work and where do you get out of your work, because it is like a pretty internal process. But yeah, rectangular painting like especially, right, like history of the square. um I know like in my recent work I've been interested in like how do you utilize mural to like break the square, like break the location, and like open up accessibility so that it's not, you know, white box on a white cube wall. Yeah.
In your work, like you mentioned, you're really inspired by the places that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
You see the nature from your recent residencies, and your style changed significantly during your Berlin residency
Mm-hmm.
after visiting all those museums and being in those spaces. And you draw from experiences within your own home, but I'm wondering how San Antonio, being your like home city, ever shows up in your work.
Yeah, sure. That is a good thing to think about. I mean, I think San Antonio is always going to show up because like it is the community that I exist in. So I think like a lot of the experiences that like I'm internalizing are also experiences that are sort of being like internalized in lockstep with people
Mm.
whose like space I share. Like I'm friends with a lot of, you know, parents who are also like working artists, and those experiences are shaped by what's going on like locally in the city, or what's sort of like locally happening, say locally, regionally happening in the state. So like certainly just like the conversations that are happening in like creative communities, parenting communities, are influencing the work, right? In terms of landscape, I don't know why I have not utilized, maybe, I don't know, maybe this is like longing for, longing for the past, but I find myself often like looking to like the past for like, if I'm thinking about the landscape, I'm thinking about like the Midwest, and I'm thinking about like growing up in Iowa and like the singular hilly formation in the state. And maybe that's like longing for like the concrete structure of childhood, right? But I feel like a lot of my references to San Antonio, in my work show up in like the interior spaces that are depicted. So like the interior of homes, like sort of like my vision of San Antonio has become very inward, right, in recent years because we've been in the home and sort of like in COVID and then like a post-COVID moment. So maybe I would say like San Antonio is reflected in like the community and also like the interior spaces. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, actually, I was doing research a couple years ago about sort of like what happens to a caterpillar when it is like turning into a butterfly, and it's like super gnarly. It's like kind of gross. Like a caterpillar cocoons itself and then it dissolves its entire body, but there's like a couple of discs that stay like as consistent genetic marker points, and like it's the thing that says like this will be your head, these will be your wings, and like these will be your arms. So not butterflies, but like was pretty interested in like the liquefaction of a caterpillar for a moment, which I think is just sort of like a beautiful metaphor for like the, you know, transition of like one moment into like another life, right? Like you cocoon yourself, you liquefy yourself, and like you emerge on the other side of puberty, or like the other side of career change and development, or the other side of parenthood. So, yeah, don't sleep on caterpillars, they're pretty cool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.